The goals and actions that your characters take need to be linked to motivations. What they do can't just be done because you want it to be done. It's got to be due to some underlying motivation. Now, the source of that motivation is actually a really interesting thing to talk about, and that's what we're going to do today with the help of this handy dandy quadrant that I've drawn out here. You can get a lot of mileage out of having characters change the reasons that they are pursuing certain actions, or having them change the actions that they pursue because their motivation is now coming from a different source. A lot of depth is created when you have characters pursuing the same actions but with different motivations. Also, the motivations that other characters believe a character has might be different from what's actually motivating that character, which are all things we're going to talk about. There are different ways to break this down, but I think the system that we're going to talk about today is one that works pretty well. It involves fitting the source of motivation into one of 4 quadrants based on 2 different axes. I borrowed this quadrant thing from some god-awful professional development conference thing that I had to sit through a number of years ago. Different people use a similar thing in different places and they call the axes different things. But the way I've set it up here, I think works particularly well for the motivations of fictional characters. So these axes are the source of motivation, whether it's internal or external to the character, and whether the motivation is driven by the avoidance of something negative or the gain of something positive. We're going to talk about each of the different quadrants and what they mean in a second, but I want to point out that none of these 4 are any better than any others. You can write a good character motivation in any of these 4 quadrants. These aren't good or bad sources of motivations categorically, though in certain situations, depending on the character, one quadrant might be better than another. Also, any of these 4 can be used for a heroic or a villainous motivation. That's kind of a different axis. Let's start with the top right quadrant, which is an external motivation for a positive gain. This motivation involves anything that can be externally acquired for the character. So it's things like wealth, property, reputation, fame, anything that the character stands to gain that is external to them, that somebody else has to bestow upon them. This can be physical things like money or treasure or property, or even something more intangible like honor or a positive reputation. And it's external because it relies on other characters or something else outside of the character in order to provide it. The quadrant below that is about avoiding the loss of something external. In the upper quadrant, the character is trying to find buried treasure. In the lower quadrant, they're trying to keep people from stealing it. In the upper quadrant, they're trying to improve their reputation. In the lower quadrant, they're trying to avoid damage to their reputation. So this is anything like the loss of money or something like shame coming from other people. This is the quadrant that if you're Catholic, you primarily operate in. This avoiding negative side of this diagram is really about remaining neutral. It's about not losing something. Are you getting your partner a gift so that they don't break up with you, or are you getting them a gift to improve the relationship? Are you writing this report so you don't get fired, or are you doing it to get a promotion? Are you leading an army to conquer new territory, or are you defending your homeland from an invader? Are you maintaining the status quo or are you trying to improve it? That's the difference between these 2 motivations. On the other side, we have internal motivations. These relate to how the character feels about themselves, regardless of anything or anybody else around them. This is where they pursue something in line with their values or avoid something that would hamper those values. I can't think of anything else to draw except a smiley face and a frowny face. There's a trope called, I think, what you are in the dark, which is basically when a character is given an opportunity to do something good or bad when nobody is watching, when there's no external repercussions, what do they choose to do? And that's kind of what this internal thing gets at. It's how the character feels about themselves. It's their own internal sense of right or wrong. It's them either avoiding negative feelings because what they're doing is going against what they feel internally about how things should be done, or it's them gaining an internal feeling of esteem for themselves based on their own internal values. It's kind of a little bit paradoxical, but the most well-developed characters, the characters with a very well-developed personal moral code, a personal value system, will often pursue things based on these two quadrants, the internal motivations. But at the same time, if you have a character who's very poorly developed, their motivations often also kind of default to these two quadrants. It's like a character who does something because it's the right thing to do will often operate in this quadrant, but a poorly developed character who is just there to make the plot happen will also be operating in this quadrant because it's the right thing to do, but in a different way. Now, a well-developed character probably won't have their motivation fit into any one of these four quadrants in a very neat way. There's going to be a lot of overlap. But at the same time, if you have a bunch of reasons that a character is pursuing something to the point where each of these quadrants kind of fits, then that can also be a sign of poorly developed motivations. A well-developed character should be pursuing things for multiple reasons, but usually there's one stronger overarching reason that they are pursuing something. They have one central strong motivation for what they do, and everything else is kind of secondary. If you just have a list of good reasons for the character to pursue something, but they themselves don't value anything above anything else, then that can be a sign that they need a little bit more development. It's like, let's say you have a professional sports ball player because they have a deep internal desire to be the best at the game of sports ball, but they're also negotiating their contract to get more money. They are motivated by both an internal and an external motivation, but the internal motivation is way stronger. The external motivation is much more secondary. I mentioned at the beginning that none of these are good or bad motivations for a character in the sense that you can create a well-written character who follows a motivation from any of these four sources. But generally, the internal positive motivations are healthier for the character. They're probably a better source of motivation than external things like wealth or avoiding things like shame. There's a lot of stories, and it's kind of a cultural trope of somebody who is just pursuing external things like fame and wealth and how that's kind of an empty pursuit and it ultimately leaves them unsatisfied, that kind of thing. There's also a lot of stories where characters spend a lot of time avoiding shame or some kind of external cultural unhappiness about what they're doing, and that's also generally not a recipe for a happy character. This system also applies really well to character arcs. Not every single type of character arc, but a lot of them will involve the character moving around this quadrant to different places. In these situations, you can either have the character change the actions that they're performing so that they move to a different point on the quadrant, or they can also change their underlying motivations, which will move them into a different part of the quadrant, even though they're pursuing the same action, but they've changed the reasons that they're pursuing that action. One example of this is from the Hatchet series by Gary Paulson. So for those of you who don't know, that story is centered around a kid who survives a plane crash in the Canadian wilderness, and he has to survive just using some kind of tool. It's like a pickaxe or a knife or a spork or... Anyway, in the initial books of the series, I would say that his motivation is this kind of external one. He wants to survive. He wants to return back to the life of Big Macs and television and cars and electric lighting. So his motivation is very external. He wants to survive, to change his external state. He works really hard to try to get rescued. He eventually does get rescued. So that's kind of his initial motivation in that series. In later books in the series, I think Brian's Return or Brian's Hunt, I forget what the later books are called. Anyway, He eventually goes back to the wilderness because he finds that he's unhappy with modern life and the endless pursuit of material things and all of that. So he actually returns to the situation. He goes back to living the way he was living in the first two books, but his motivation has changed. It's now an internal motivation because going back to the wilderness is now aligned with his values. So this is an example of a character through an arc who ends up performing the same actions, pursuing the same goal, but their motivation has shifted from external to internal. They're doing the same thing, but they're doing it for different reasons. You can also have characters who believe they are pursuing something for one reason, but they're actually pursuing it for a different reason. This is very common when you have characters who... You can also play around with characters who think they're pursuing one thing or think other characters are pursuing something, or characters who are being told the reasons that they're pursuing something. One example of this is Holes by Louis Sachar. That story centers around a juvenile detention facility where the inmates are forced to dig holes in a dried lake bed all day under the hot sun. The inmates are told by the staff there that the reason they're digging holes is to build character, whatever that means, which is an internal positive motivation. Most of the inmates, I would say, are actually digging holes in order to avoid negative repercussions from the guards or whatever. So they're actually operating in this quadrant. And it turns out, as is revealed later on, that the reason they're digging holes is because there's buried treasure or like a stolen pig with onions or something in the lake. Anyway, the actual reason, the actual motivation for them digging holes is to find the buried treasure. So they're told that they're operating in this quadrant. Most of them actually operate in this quadrant because they don't actually care about building character because they're a bunch of juvenile delinquents. And it turns out what they're actually doing is pursuing wealth for somebody else. Plotting the motivation of villains on this quadrant is also interesting. I would argue that most supervillains, like the godlike Saurons and Big Brothers of the world, are actually usually operating in this quadrant. I think most of the top tier villains are pursuing villainy because of deeply ingrained motivations that are very much internal to them. Villains who are further down the pecking order are often in the external gain quadrant. These are your paid henchmen or your mercenaries or your thieves. They're just doing villainous things because they have a chance to gain reputation or fame or money. Though you can also have minions who are more like zealots and believers who operate in this quadrant where they've been brainwashed to believe whatever the villain is telling them, that sort of thing. And then you can also have villains who are subjugated or forced into villainy for fear of repercussions, and they operate in this quadrant where they're avoiding a negative loss if they don't act in a villainous way. You can also plot like a redemption arc on this kind of quadrant. So you may, for instance, with a lot of villains who go through redemption arcs, they sometimes start in this quadrant, but they often start in this quadrant because they're just pursuing wealth or fame or a reputation or power or whatever. Then something happens, they start to lose faith in pursuing this stuff, they lose the desire to gain all of this stuff. They might move down into this quadrant because now they're stuck in this villainous world and they can't leave it. So they continue to be a villain, but now they're doing it to avoid negative repercussions. And then the actual redemption, the actual turn from villain to hero, usually moves them into this quadrant, or they might move directly into this quadrant where they give up their villainous ways and they're now pursuing a new internal motivation, which is much more aligned with what they want to actually do and is much healthier for them. A lot of times when you have a self-sacrifice redemption arc where the villain sacrifices themselves at the last minute to do something heroic, but they don't end up surviving it, that's often when you have them move from this quadrant directly into this quadrant, but they're not able to survive for whatever reason. So takeaways from this before we end, because this video is getting excessively long at this point. I think thinking about what quadrant your character's motivations fits into can be really helpful here. I think you definitely want to have different characters who fit into different quadrants. If a character doesn't fit, or if their motivation doesn't fit neatly into one of these quadrants, that's okay, but there should still be an overarching quadrant that they kind of fit into. I think you can get a lot of mileage out of moving characters around from different quadrants, usually to the extra or the internal positive motivation. That's usually where the positive character arcs tend to go. But you can move them around different quadrants depending on what it is you want to do. I'd love to know what you think about this in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Just gonna throw the marker onto the table.